Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing neuroscience and behavior in the first section of chapter 3. And so to begin with, we'll just talk about the origin of our behavior in terms of biology. And so the first concept that the chapter talks about are neurons. And so neurons, the most basic structure that impacts our behavior are neurons, and there are over 100 billion neurons in our brain alone and up to 500 throughout our bodies, all of which communicate with one another by processing information coming in from the environment and sending out information to the rest of the body. And so again, this is the most basic element that impacts our behavior. And as we can see with this snapshot of one neuron, there are several structural divisions within just one neuron. And so as we can see on this specific neuron, this is one neuron right here. This is the whole neuron, and then this is the beginning of another neuron. And so with this, we'll be discussing each one of these structures and how they assist in processing and transferring information, and I will refer back to this picture throughout the presentation. Components of the neuron include three basic parts, including the cell body, dendrites, and axons. And so the cell body, which is also known as a soma, is the largest component of a neuron, and its job is to coordinate information processing tasks. And so this is the soma is involved in protein synthesis, producing energy, and metabolizing. And this contains the nucleus, which of course contains or houses our chromosomes that contain our DNA. And also within the cell body, it's surrounded by this porous membrane that allows molecules to flow in and out of the cell freely. And so the second part of a neuron, the most basic part, are these dendrites. And so here within the picture we have the cell body and the nucleus and these dendrites. And so the dendrites in Greek are translated as tree. And so this is due to their tree-like appearance. And so they have long arms with almost fingers coming out. And so what the dendrites do, they receive neurotransmitters and either initiate or prevent a new electrical signal, which is a process called synaptic transmission. And so we'll actually get to that towards the end of the presentation. And so the last basic part of a neuron is called an axon. And the axon is a specialized extension of the neuron that facilitates communication by transmitting information down the neuron. And so here we see this long extension that transmits all of that information that they're getting from the dendrites going to the cell body, and then the axon is just almost like a railway for that information to go down the neuron. And so one thing about neurons is that each neuron has one axon, and within this axon they can actually be as long as a meter. And one example within our bodies of one of the longest axons is the axon or the neuron that we have from the spinal cord, our spinal cords, all the way to our big toe. And within each axon, what we'll see are these different structures that we'll see here within this circle. So each axon, as we can see here, end in these terminal buttons. And so here we have it labeled. So the axon reaches out and ends within terminal buttons. And with these terminal buttons, here's a snapshot here of the terminal button itself. They have these tiny bags that are called vesicles, and they contain neurotransmitters. And within these neurotransmitters are chemicals that transmit information across the synapse to a receiving neuron. And so here, as we see, the dendrites receive information, they transfer it to the cell body or the synapse, it goes all the way down the axon to the terminal button, which then releases the neurotransmitters or chemical information to a neighboring neuron. So here, between two neurons, we have the synapse. So again, here is the terminal button, and then there's just this little area that the neurotransmitters are free to roam, and this is known as the synapse. And this is one of the major components of the neuron that helps the neuron to function. And so the synapse is a small gap region between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite cells of a second neighboring neuron. So within the synapse is where the first neuron sends these neurotransmitters and the second neuron picks them up or receives them. So the second component that is essential to the neuron and helps them to function includes this myelin sheath. And so this myelin sheath surrounds the axon right here, and it is this fatty tissue that surrounds the axon and enables the axon to quickly transmit that information down the axon, and it allows it to be more efficient in transmitting that information. And so within the myelin sheath is made up of glial cells, and these glial cells serves as a support team for the nervous system by creating this myelin sheath, and it also digests parts of neurons that are dead and provide physical and nutritional support for the neuron. Here we have another example of the terminal button releasing neurotransmitters from their vesicles, which transmit these chemical messages to another neuron. And the neurotransmitters are released into the synapse, or the space between two neurons. And then the receiving neuron either accepts or rejects these neurotransmitters. So I think this is a great picture that allows you to observe each part of the neuron, and it will actually be very helpful for you to refer back to this picture when you're studying, and if you want to label each part of the neuron and talk about their function. I think that will especially help you to study. And so if we're looking at this one neuron, here we have the dendrites, and they're receiving information from another neuron. So they're receiving that information on their receptors. So the receptors are at the end of a dendrite. They receive the information. It goes down the dendrite into the cell body and the nucleus, which coordinate where this information goes and what to actually do with this information. They send this information down the axon, and the axon is coated essentially with a myelin sheath that acts to transmit those messages even faster and more efficiently on down the axon to the terminal buttons, where the terminal buttons then releases that information onto another neuron. So here, now that we've talked about the different structures of a neuron, here we talk about the major types of neurons. And so with this, there are three major types of neurons. And these include sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. So sensory neurons are specialized neurons that process signals that are coming from our environment, like light, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Motor neurons assist us in producing movement. And then lastly, most neurons are actually the third type of neuron, which is the interneuron. So the interneurons help to facilitate that communication between sensory neurons and motor neurons. And they do this in order to perform even the most simple tasks. And one example of this is that these interneurons help to identify the location of a sensory signal. So am I touching something with my finger, or did I step on something painful with my foot, or even recognize a familiar face. And so this leads us to talking about the electrical chemical actions of neurons. And so we know the structure, we know the function, we know what types there are. And now what do these neurons actually do? What type of information do they transmit? And so the communication between and within neurons is known as an electrical chemical action. So an important fact to remember about this is that the flow of information within a neuron, so if that's within this axon right here, it is a type of electrical message or electrical signal. And when it's outside of the neuron, or with the dendrites between two synapses and the terminal buttons, it's a chemical signal or chemical message. And so that's something important to remember. And this occurs in two stages. One is conduction and the other is transmission. And with this, you'll notice that when I went through the picture and discussed each of the parts of the neurons and their function, I had mentioned electrical and chemical messages. And so this will be an important aspect to remember and to study for the test. Messages that are making the neuron either fire a message or not fire a message. These include sodium and potassium. And so as potassium and sodium flow across the cell membrane, they move this neuron, or this presynaptic neuron that's getting ready to fire, from a resting potential where it's just sitting there with no electrical messages going on, it's just resting, this resting potential, to an action potential where it is gearing up to send an electrical message. In a nutshell, all of the conduction and transmission, all of this is what this is saying is that here is a chemical message that is being transmitted between two neurons. And so the dendrites and the receptors pick up that chemical message, and then once it gets into the axon or inside the neuron, then it turns into an electrical signal. And once the electrical signal makes its way down into the terminal buttons, then again it turns into a chemical message, because it's leaving one neuron and going into the dendrites and the receptors of another neuron. And so if you'll remember, chemical going on down to the axon is electrical, and then back down to the terminal buttons is another chemical message. When we talk about conduction and electric signaling, we have this natural difference inside and outside of the neuron. And when the neuron fires that electrical message down the axon, there's a difference in charge that facilitates this very fast response, or that very fast transmitting of information, kind of like a lightning strike. And with this, neurons have a natural electrical charge on the inside, which is called a resting potential, and it's about -70 millivolts. And this is the difference between the inside and the outside of the neuron, or the cell's membrane, neuron's cell membrane. And this is similar to a positive and negative charge on a battery. So thinking about the negative charge on the inside of the neuron and the positive charge on the outside of the neuron. So in a resting state, again, we have a -70 millivolt charge on the inside of the neuron. And so what we do know of the neuron is that the neuron is at resting potential most of the time, and following this action potential, so after it fires one of these electrical messages, then there's what's known as a refractory period. And so during this time, the neuron is essentially charging up. So it's resting, it's in this refractory period, it has just shot off an electrical message, and now it is charging up in order to initiate another action potential. And so neurons have this all or none type of function where they give all their energy to an electrical signal or they do not fire at all. And with this all or none, once the threshold is reached, then the action potential begins. If the signal is not strong enough, though, if it's not charged up enough, then nothing happens. And so with this, here are just again some textbook definitions on the resting potential and the action potential. Here we have a close-up picture of the myelin sheath that surrounds the axon and these nodes of Ranvier. And with this, the signal travel, or the action potential, travels faster down myelinated axons because the myelin sheath again helps to transmit that information faster and more efficiently. But when it does, with these nodes of Ranvier, these little spots where there is no myelin sheath, the signal actually jumps over in between these nodes of Ranvier rather than going down the whole length of the axon. And so this is called saltatory conduction, and it helps to transmit that information even faster.